This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cincinnati area attorney Joey Ashbrook.
Hey, Mike. Happy Saturday.
Yay, Joey. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
You know, it's been a rough day for me. As many folks know, I'm a big Steelers fan, and I'm very concerned about T.J. Watt and his collapsed lung. One thing I will say, folks, if you're interested in trying dry needling, think twice about it. I've had some experiences, and they were not good, though not nearly as bad as TJ's. So anyway, before we do get started, I want to thank a few new supporters, Gretchen and Jim, as well as longtime supporter Robert, who moved from monthly to yearly support, saved himself 10% in the process. So thank you all very much. We really do appreciate that. So we'll start with Venezuela. And, you know, missile strikes against Venezuelan boats allegedly carrying drugs, they've been going on since early September. And at this point, something like 22 ships have been hit so far, with an estimated 87 people killed in the missile attacks. This week, the U.S. ratcheted up the pressure on Venezuela by seizing a tanker carrying oil after a federal judge issued a seizure warrant for the ship, which had allegedly carried sanctioned Iranian oil. Now, administration officials say they expect to conduct additional seizures as well over the next few weeks. And at this point, it's unclear what will happen to the oil on board the tanker, which is worth tens of millions of dollars, though the U.S. is taking legal steps to keep that oil. Also this week, the U.S. has issued new sanctions on the Venezuelan oil sector and several members of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's family. And this all ties into the administration's main goal of destabilizing the Maduro regime, which is unquestionably corrupt and deeply involved in not just drug trafficking, but a host of awful things like illegal gold mining, smuggling sanctioned oil, money laundering, financial crimes, human trafficking. The question here is not whether Maduro is a bad actor. He absolutely is. The question, at least in my view, or questions are whether the actions the Trump administration has taken are legally justified, what, if any, limiting principles apply here, and whether increased U.S. pressure will force Maduro from power without the sort of escalation that might turn this, well, at this point, still relatively low-level conflict into something that more resembles an all-out war. And I thought we could start with the legal authority questions. Now, I don't see any issue with seizing the tanker, and the sanctions seem to me to be entirely within the administration's authority, so that leaves us with the missile strikes. Now, the administration isn't citing any specific legal authority other than the president's inherent powers under Article 2 of the Constitution. And other presidents have absolutely done this. You had Clinton for the airstrikes in Sudan, Obama in Libya, Biden in Syria and Iraq. But what differentiates those cases is that the attacks were directed against armed groups, and with the very notable exception of Obama's Libya strikes, they also posed an imminent threat to U.S. forces. So, Joad, like I said, I wanted to start there. What do you think? Is citing inherent powers enough here?
Well, when the Constitution gives those powers to the officer, that officer has the power to act. So I think it is enough here. And I'm curious from you, though, because I think one of the questions that's helpful is analytically how you view the designation to begin with, that what he's dealing with is he's disrupting supply chains of narco-terrorism, that the confluence between the funding of terrorist activities and the hurting of America by drug organizations and cartels, and that they are designated terrorist organizations. I think the way I look at this issue, people can have a policy debate over whether or not, over the drug war and how you deal with the interdiction and disrupt drug traffic in the United States and how you address that. But I'm not sure that if you view the drug war if you view the drug war and the cartel activity is both from a financial standpoint, funding terrorism and harming Americans coming from the outside in as a question of legal authority, to me, it's not a very difficult question that the President of the United States can use American force outside of America's borders to protect Americans within the borders. So to me, the first threshold question, Mike, is what do you think about the drug aspect of it? And do you think that it's a mislabeled designation? I guess another way of saying, is your concern really a policy concern or is your concern a legal concern?
Well, it's not, I guess it's not really a policy concern in that I believe, and I think any reasonable person would have to conclude, this is an awful regime that is involved with a bunch of bad stuff. And I think we should take aggressive steps to do what we can to ensure that that regime's actions do not negatively affect American citizens. So absolutely. But again, to me, it's a question not so much of ends. But not with a lot of stuff, but there's some stuff that the Trump administration does that I just say, oh my God, I don't like any of this. But there are other things, and this fits into this case, where I say, I like the goal, or at least I mostly like the goal, but I'm concerned about the means, because my first question is, well, okay, why not Coast Guard interdiction? I mean, that's the standard and unquestionably legal way of doing this. And I'm not clear what the military action gets us that Coast Guard interdiction doesn't, especially if we do interdiction, then presumably we gain information, we build a case, we learn more about what's going on, and also we don't end up killing a bunch of people. And so I guess what do you think about that? I mean, what's the advantage? What do you see as the advantages of blowing boats out of the water as opposed to just doing this the way that we've done it for quite a long time, using the Coast Guard, oftentimes with assists from the Navy?
Well, I mean, the way we've done the drug war for a really long time has been arguably ineffectual. And you've got the flow of drugs into America and the level of American drug-related deaths over the last 10, 15 years is not in the positive trends. Well, that's why I think about it going all the way back to what you think about the drug war concept. But there's a lot of people who thought, hey, the war on drugs is lost, so we need to do it differently because it's a waste of energy. And you may even have some libertarian impulses of live and let live that think that that's not the kind of thing that you overly care about. It's hard to talk about that when people are dying, but there are a lot of people who have those impulses. And I think in the post-1980s world of the drug wars, a lot of people had those views and those impulses. I find it extremely believable and non-controversial that you've got South American cartel personnel and affiliates running drugs into America via speedboats in the Caribbean. And the military and its presence and its ability to strike and its satellite capabilities in the way the chain works is situated to intercept, disrupt, and destroy the logistical and supply chain means of getting those drugs to America. So it's taking a step out outside the fence and keeping them from ever getting inside the fence. Now, the question of whether you think that's a good thing or not, I can understand. It's hard for me to understand that argument that it's a bad thing unless you think that the war on drugs is a lost war. And you have to think that the cartels and the drug conduit is actually not a funding conduit for terrorism. I find none of those to be difficult propositions to accept. In fact, that's my view of it. And I think it's extremely likely, even if I think this administration, I do believe, is transparent. They're showing videos. I mean, you may not see everything, but I don't think they overly hide things close to their vest. As administrations go, I think they're more transparent than most of the previous administrations, maybe all of them in the modern era. And the idea that our intelligence services say, these guys are running drugs directly for the United States and money that's going to be reinforcing terrorism to harm the United States and our interests. And we've got the capability to stop them before they get here. And that's really all they're doing. I don't see it as any different than Obama doing counterterrorism strikes abroad or over the horizon capability. The horizon is just a little closer to our shores. And I think I personally see this as more political than it is substantive, and wanting to say people are guilty of war crimes because it's like calling them a Nazi. You brand them as bad people, you're a war criminal, you're a Nazi, when in reality, what they're doing is largely controversial, unless you think, hey, we've never done this way with drugs before. But that's true of almost everything Trump does, or things we've never done before. And that's why he gets results we don't get before, haven't gotten before.
I'm with you on intercept and disrupt. I think that's fine. I think destroy makes no sense to me because I would rather seize than destroy, because it seems to me the advantages of seizing are, number one, well, we get stuff we wouldn't have otherwise, whether that's intelligence or the actual physical, boats, not necessarily worth a whole lot. But the destroy thing, I mean, on that part of it, the people being killed here are not drug kingpins. I mean, they're typically poor Venezuelan, poor Colombian folks. They're fishermen who are turned into couriers, sometimes coerced into their roles. And it seems to me all those factors suggest that I would be fine with incredibly beefed up Coast Guard interdiction with military assist, but just simple destroying, that goes too far for me. I think the negatives far outweigh the positives. And certainly, I guess on the other thing I wanted to respond to is on the transparency issue. I know that some listeners would say, oh my God, would disagree with you entirely. I don't agree with you on that, but I think that's another, I won't get into that, but I do want to kind of just note that I don't know that I agree on the transparency thing, but I kind of put that aside as sort of a side issue. But to me, the limiting principle argument is really important here, because if we accept this argument that drug trafficking coordinated by a foreign government, that's an imminent threat, and that's the argument that the administration is making, it's not an unreasonable argument on its face. But then I say, well, okay, if that's the case, would it be, under this logic, legitimate for, say, U.S. Border Patrol to shoot and kill a low-level courier who's attempting to smuggle drugs at the border? Just, you see a guy, he's got a backpack, they look like drugs, you think they might be drugs, he's headed toward the border, and you say, let's just put a couple of 50 caliber rounds in him. How is that? I'm struggling to understand how that's different from what we're doing with the boats, except it's smaller scale, or maybe your argument is that both are okay.
Well, I think that the limiting principle is the will of the people in electing the person, the executive, to make the decisions of what's in the best interest of American security and what's needed. The president needs the flexibility to be able to make decisions on the fly, and they're never going to be 100% perfect. Nobody ever makes 100% perfect decisions. You try to make them, but so the flexibility to actually use your judgment and make decisions, and then if the people don't like it, they vote for somebody else. That's really the limiting principle. Otherwise, because you're always going to be second guessed by people who don't like you, and they're going to call you a war criminal because it's just a rhetorical device to try to marginalize you or dehumanize you or gain credibility for opposition to you. And so that's always going to happen. We're always going to have that. The president needs the ability, whether it's Barack Obama or Donald Trump, to be able to, as the commander in chief, protect Americans. I think that if border agents do something that's clearly wrong, depending on the situation, they would be held account for doing something that's clearly wrong. But this is a policy decision from the commander in chief, where strikes are being made that are going to have JAG officers who are present doing law of war type analysis. Arguably, they're probably over red taped. No matter what we might like to think, they're probably criticizable as having too much red tape in what they do. So you're going to have all of those strictures. And I think he's within his discretion as the commander in chief. Even if I can understand people who may not like it from a policy standpoint, but from a legal standpoint, I don't know how it could be another way. Gotcha. You don't want the president needing to get 7 layers of permission to act quickly and make decisions. And also, you don't want the president who the people vote for to have to get the permission of the people who the people didn't vote for when he makes decisions related to what's he going to do.
So then, in your view, the limiting principle would, at least when it comes to national security on presidential power, would be elections and impeachment and removal. That would be basically it.
It's not exclusively it, but there's a really wide range.
Okay.
My
Okay.
point is, I don't think that this issue presents anything close to the edge of the range.
Okay.
From a legal standpoint, what his authority is.
Yeah.
But I don't see that there's any other way. He's
Okay.
not going to, we're not going to hand a guy or female someday a manual and say, this is what you got to do. And we just can't control it like that. Life's too organic and we're not better off like that. And it requires common human sense and a moral core to do the right things, not the wrong things. But we're not going to stick them with a manual. And I think it's more
Yeah,
politics. I think,
got it.
honestly, I think this is more politics than law.
Okay. Do you think, in your view, would have been better? Would it be better for this to be happening with congressional authorization? And do you think that the Trump administration should have at least attempted to get that authorization, or no?
I think anytime you get congressional engagement on something, it's a good thing. I don't think it's required. And for the speed, I personally do not like the level of American governance that happens through executive order vis-a-vis legislation. I think that's unhealthy.
Yeah, me too.
But I think it's also fundamentally a problem of the legislature, not just the executive. And it's a monument to our broken legislature.
Yeah, sure. I guess the other thing I wonder about is the end game here. I mean,
Uh-huh.
I'm not clear what it is exactly. I mean, we want Maduro gone, certainly, and that would be great. But I'm thinking, well, this certainly has the potential to actually strengthen Maduro domestically, because that whole imperialist U.S. sort of thing. And actually, I mean, we have a history that resonates in South America and Central America for a very good reason. And so my concern is this strengthens Maduro domestically unless we turn up the pressure so much and for long enough that he feels he's backed into a corner, and all of a sudden we have something that's a lot more than just a few U.S. strikes. It becomes something that starts to look a lot more like a sort of a low-level shooting war, which, at least at present, most Americans don't seem to want.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have the intelligence in front of me or know the intelligence on the ground in Venezuela. I think that America's imperial past is more complicated than America as an imperial nation. Yes, America has done things abroad in the past, but in the scope of human history, relative to other nations of the last 500 years, America is inordinately different in the way it has approached its foreign policy and interaction with other countries, and is by far the least imperial of the legacy Western civilization nations. And so the flip side question of what you don't know is socialism and leftist control of governments that happens in some South American countries. It's not a recipe for human flourishing. The folks in Venezuela may be ready to get rid of Maduro because they may want something else. And then it's just allies who have something to gain because their wealth, their status, their power, their livelihood, their safety is tied to the cult of the personality in the governmental regime. And you just don't know how weak that is. And you can hear people say, depending on what news story or editorial piece you see, people are going to take one of those two approaches based on the end game of what their argument is. I don't know what it really is like internally. I do agree with you that I think the end game is a very interesting question here. I'd have a hard time seeing President Trump get involved in some sort of regime change military action. It
I
goes
hope so.
against his entire ethos. I will say, though, his unpredictable nature makes him effective in that he does not want to be involved, but he also eschews absolute rules in his conduct and decision-making, which makes people have to ingest the reality that maybe they do have to be on the opposite side of American power, and helps him reach deals. So
Yeah.
I do agree with you. In humility, I have to admit, I do not exactly know how this is going to end, and I'm sure I ain't the only guy.
Yeah.
If
Yeah,
they're
I
honest, says that. I don't know. I have no idea how the end game works. If Maduro steps aside, maybe they'll give him another. Maybe they'll add that to the Peace Prize dynamic because he should win the next one.
Well, given our record of regime change, and regime change is a hard thing to do well, and certainly we have not, and for a lot of reasons. That's why I think it's a big mistake to even move slightly in that direction. But we'll say, I guess for me, the bottom line, and this is, some people will say I'm being overly idealistic, but I think about the families of those 87 people who were killed, and I think I still believe in America American exceptionalism in a good way, that we hold ourselves, and we should hold ourselves, to a higher standard. And then I think, well, if we can accomplish the goals we want to accomplish, even if it takes a little bit more, by killing fewer people, that's the path I want us to go on. And I just keep on coming back to those 87 people that we killed. That just sticks in my craw in a way, and calling them collateral damage just makes me almost a little ill, I suppose, because not because I don't understand and appreciate the concept of collateral damage, I certainly do, but because I think there was another way to do this that wouldn't have involved our killing 87 people. And that, again, overly idealistic, maybe so, but that's kind of where I land on this in the end.
Well, Mike, if they're driving a speedboat that's got a whole bunch of drugs in it, even if they're not, I can't see them as victims in the situation. We shouldn't be running drugs for the cartels into the United States. I understand people have tough situations, and I'm certainly nobody's judge in life generally, but there are awful lot of Americans that are going to die from those drugs, and there's money that's going to get funded, that's going to get sent to terrorists. I don't have to have the paperwork in front of me tracing that to you. Just as a matter of human nature, I'd be surprised if it's not. I mean, there's not dumb people.
Sure.
Terrorists are not dumb people. They're smart people. It's just they're in the wrong. I'd be surprised if that money's not going to terrorists. So the people who are running the boats, if we stop the boats, it's appropriate. It's not avoiding casualties in the real world that we live in is not possible. And the amount of American casualties from the drugs on the other side would be outweighed, but I don't think you need to do a utilitarian cost-benefit analysis of the number of lives on this kind of thing. I think it just comes down to, if you think that drug interdiction is something that the president should aggressively do, including with force, then shooting missiles at the speedboats that the Coast Guard cutters aren't just going to be able to get a net around and catch, because we have the satellite ability with our eyes in the sky and our ability now to cover with intelligence what's going on. We have the ability to actually destroy those. To me, it comes down to your view on the war on drugs. If it doesn't bother you, the president's aggressive outside of our borders to prevent that, and you think that this money's also going to terrorists, so there's an additional amplifying aspect of disrupting the terror network supply chain, then using force outside the United States to blow that up in small scales, one boat at a time, is an appropriate use of the presidential power. And I know people are going to die from it, but people die when Obama's shooting the missiles, blowing up folks in Libya and other Middle Eastern countries. So, but I do share with you that I think that our ideals and living up to who we are as a nation and our exceptionalism is part of what helps us project power abroad, because of you're always in a narrative war of who's the real evil. And America is not. And America is a great nation. And we should always, to the greatest extent of our ability, live up to those ideals. I don't see this as sacrificing those ideals. I see it as a question of, unless you think of the drug policy, that we should not be stepping outside of our borders and using force that's not just police force, then to me, that's the question. I do have on that, though, to ask you, one of the distinctions that's now being made as the story kind of changes. I saw a piece, Leon Panetta wrote an op-ed or did an interview, and I recently read. He was talking about the use of the military for police action, which I thought was an interesting take. Do you want to talk about that? Do you personally buy into that distinction of this is a police issue, it's akin to, the drug war is akin to domestic law enforcement. It's not an issue of foreign protection for the United States. And then that's a reason that this is inappropriate. What's your take on that?
I don't have a clear-cut answer, because I think I'll give a sort of a political sciences sort of answer. It depends, because I think you can make a stronger case for something like the Maduro regime, because it seems very clear that this is, in fact, the ties between the regime and all of those nefarious things, including the drugs, are so very clear and strong. And so then it seems to me the line between law enforcement and military national security, that starts to get a little bit hazy. And that's, in fact, why I like the idea of getting congressional authorization, at least maybe not for one-off strikes, but if there is going to be an extended campaign, because that brings these questions out into the open, and then there can be debate among all of the democratically elected representatives at the federal level. I think that's a real healthy thing. And that's why I would hope that any administration, if they're planning more than just a one-off attack, that they bring Congress into negotiations. I know it's messy. I know it slows things down, but I think it's really important if we are to, in fact, uphold those standards that we as Americans, I think, still believe in.
Yeah. One of the I'll just say this and then we can pivot to the next segment. I think that Mr. Panetta's argument discloses a fallacy of the way some of my friends who disagree think about America and the world, and the idea that outside our borders that we're the world's policemen, and that more of what I'll non-charitably frame as the left's view of law enforcement domestically is a paradigm for our role in the world globally. I've historically always thought my friends are exactly wrong of how we operate in the world. We should be that we're lambs abroad and lions at home against each other. I don't like that. If anything, we should be lambs at home, even when we disagree, and giving each other space to disagree, and lions abroad, because that's what protects the American nation and this experiment that's now 250 years old of a belief of self-government, and that regular people can thrive and they don't need just a couple people controlling them. And what protects that is that we're forceful outside of our borders where we have to be without being everybody else's policemen. And then we live and let live a little bit inside the country, and we don't have to be lions on each other and force each other to live life the way we think that you should live life.
Yeah, the world is a messy place, and these are not easy questions. That's for sure. But and I'm sure that we will be coming back to the Venezuela issue. This is certainly not something that will end this week, or I don't think anytime soon.
All right, Mike, let's go ahead and pivot to our next issue, which is talking about the case of Trump v. Slaughter. And my friend, this is and presents a never-ending series of potential rabbit trails, because separation of powers is just like that. But I think the best way to start is with a little story. In 1933, newly elected President Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to remove a commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission, who was appointed by Herbert Hoover, his predecessor, Mr. Humphrey. He asked Mr. Humphrey to resign. Mr. Humphrey said no. And so the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said, "Mr. Humphrey, you are fired." Well, shortly after being dismissed, Mr. Humphrey passed away, and his executor of his estate sued to collect Mr. Humphrey's salary, arguing that the statute that created the Federal Trade Commission only allowed the commissioner to be removed for cause. The specific language is a little more complicated than that, but for cause, malfeasance, gross dereliction of duty, the president couldn't just remove him because the president disagreed. The Supreme Court of the United States, who was not a friend of Mr. Roosevelt at the time, agreed with Mr. Humphrey's executor, creating a case and precedent in the American canon called Humphrey's Executor that is often referred to with respect to separation of powers and Congress's ability to limit the president's removal power over what is sometimes called independent agencies, which has been itself a catalyst for the explosion of the administrative state and agencies that operate in the executive sphere, but not necessarily under the executive's authority. So fast forward to today. Mr. Trump would like to fire, and in fact has fired, FTC Commissioner Rebecca Slaughter. And that's how we get the case of Trump versus Slaughter. And she says, "Oh, you can't do that. Humphrey's executor says you can't do that. That was the FTC. That was an FTC commissioner, same Congress. Today, the FTC still exists. You're trying to fire me. You can't under Supreme Court precedent." Trump v. Slaughter is the argument about whether or not the president can in fact remove Commissioner Slaughter, and whether Humphrey's executor as a case, if the answer to that is yes, has to be overruled. Now, there are deep policy questions related to, there's issues of law and policy. The policy questions, though, fundamentally come down to how much do you like the idea that you can have independent agencies led by experts that the president of the United States cannot remove. Is that a good thing, or is limited in his ability to remove? Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? And interestingly, before I tee that to you, because I think that's the first threshold question, and then we can talk the legal pieces. I listened to the oral argument. And if you Google stories, you can generally see that the prevailing conventional wisdom is that the belief is that the court is going to allow the president to fire Commissioner Slaughter. But how the court does that, and that was my take too in listening to the argument, but how the court does that is less certain. The court, now, folks from my side of thinking who believe in the unitary executive, and that means that when the Constitution vests the executive power in Article 2 into a governmental actor into the United States, it vests the entire executive power, the vesting clause does, into the president of the United States, not the president and the executive branch and a whole bunch of really smart people who are all well-meaning and are our best and brightest, even if self-crowned best and brightest, to make decisions. It's in the president. But so there's a lot of thinking that Humphrey's executor needs to be overruled because it countenances a path of folly in our American constitutional order that's contrary to the text of the Constitution. But I think it's important to bear in mind that the FTC is very different today than it was in 1933 with Mr. Roosevelt. And it actually, what it does day to day is far more enforcement than it did back then, where maybe it exercised more quasi-legislative or judicial authority within the agency than it does today. And it does an awful lot of enforcement that looks like what the president's supposed to do. So it's also possible that they could stop short of overruling Humphrey's executor and limiting Humphrey's executor in its analysis in the current situation and still allow the president to remove Commissioner Slaughter. And why that's important, and if you listen to the oral argument, why that's important, is because a lot of the oral argument, everybody's arguing about, well, what's the logical limitation to your argument? Well, if we go with you, then we have all these problems. Then the other side comes up but if we go with you, we have all those problems and no one ever wants to say the limitation because they know there's problems and, oh, that's not my problem. Oh, that's your problem. Mm-hmm. It's because the constitutional separation of powers is not a manual and it's not extremely well defined, but the executive power is vested in the president. So what about the Federal Reserve? I think that it's likely that the president is going to get to fire Commissioner Slaughter. I would not be remotely surprised if the current Supreme Court does not allow the president to just fire an appointee on the Federal Reserve. And it gets into the differences between them, but the FTC and the Federal Reserve, but I don't think that's really the most interesting thing for us to talk about today. I just raise it because that's there. So I think the most likely scenario is they stop short of overruling Humphrey's executor and instead they cabinet in some way with an analysis that leaves the door open to preserve certain long-standing quasi-private American agency commissions like the Federal Reserve that are distinct and different from a bureaucratic administrative state run by experts, not people serving at executive officers serving at the president's pleasure. So, as I said, and I floated some of them, this is like a national park full of rabbit trails, but I think the best place to start for discussion is the fundamental policy point about our independent agencies where the president cannot remove the head except under good cause or malfeasance. Is that a good thing, Mike, because we want our government to be run by experts, or is that a bad thing because those people are not elected by the people?
It depends. Well, because it does. And I guess it can be a good thing, certainly, for accountability purposes, but also the fundamental problem here is that Humphrey's executor was a horrible decision. It was weak sauce, even at the time, and everyone knew that it was weak sauce. And the reason why we got it is because Congress doesn't actually want to do a big part of its job. And so, this is kind of a win-win sort of thing. We create these quasi-independent agencies, right? Congress does, sorry. They can turn over the actual authority to the agency, and then the responsibility then lies there, because that's what Congress really wants. They don't want the responsibility. They don't want the work. I don't know what they're doing, but that's, and so the executive gets more power, but it's Congress essentially abrogating their their power, trying to give it away to the executive. Justice, I believe it was Justice Kavanaugh and I want to say Justice Gorsuch who raised that question about, aren't there some serious non-delegation doctrine questions here? And I think absolutely they are. Congress has wanted to have it both ways for a long time, and that's not okay. And it creates some very real problems because on this issue, I think as a matter of law, I believe that Humphrey's executor is a horrible precedent, should absolutely be overruled. And that whole business about quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative, that just doesn't hardly even pass my smell test. And now, can you argue that the Fed is different? Yeah, you can sort of do that, sort of a sui generis sort of thing because it's independently funded. It has this kind of weird governing structure, but still, that's a stretch. And I think the problem here is that the court finds itself in a bind, is that they understand that if they just overturn this entirely, it's going to be a disaster because since the 1930s, Congress created a bunch of these things, giving all sorts of power to the executive branch with the understanding it was constrained by this BS precedent, right? You pull away that precedent, and all of a sudden, this is a massive increase in presidential power that Congress never intended because they thought that backstop was going to be there. You remove that, and you have chaos, and that's why the Supreme Court. I think you're right. They're gonna write some convoluted, doesn't pass my smell test, of decision that says what the Fed is different or this is just for this agency because they have to weigh the practicalities here. But as a matter of law, this seems to me to be reasonably clear. And unfortunately, though, I think we have to deal with the political realities that this is kind of problematic.
Well, wow, Mike, I gotta get you speaking on behalf of the things I believe in sometimes. I love the pitch to just can Humphrey's executor. I like how you mentioned and picked up Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh and the talking a little bit about non-delegation and the intelligible principle and the extent to which the real problem here is, which I think you laid out well, is that the president well, you mean if the president really can remove these people because he's in charge, then how much power does he really have? Because part of the problem is you're giving a lot of power. You're giving up your power, Congress. You are delegating to other people to do your job for you. So the most sweeping, I don't know if they'll take the opportunity because I don't know where all the votes and views are on the court. And it's really complicated because there's a lot of consequence to what they do. Yeah. The most sweeping thing would be to drop Humphrey's executor and contemporaneous do a major movement related to reinvigorating the non-delegation doctrine and dynamics related to preventing Congress from offshoring its responsibilities to other people. And then all of a sudden there isn't that much power in the agencies because there can only be power in there that lawfully exists. You don't have the same issue. And then it comes back to Congress having to do it. But I'm curious on the question of an experts and agencies versus Congress making decisions. You tend to be more of I know our listenership is probably more 80-20 Democrat impulse, and you yourself are a little more center left. Do you have a gut level view on whether you think we should have career experts making rulemaking decisions that are legislative in nature, or that if Congress should be doing that? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I do have, I think, a fairly...
And a former academic and an academic too. So I really want your take on this.
I think there are two domains here. And it seems to me the proper domain of Congress is to set very clear guardrails and to give these agencies fairly narrow lanes in which to work. Now, and within those lanes, I think absolutely I want technical experts making technical decisions. For instance, on vaccine policy, I don't want some guy who read a few anti-vax articles holding forth on what science says about vaccines, but I think in general about public health policy, well, then that's different. And so the problem to me is that Congress is not doing its job, is that they have given far too much, far too broad authority to these agencies. And so we end up with a situation where these agencies have all this authority, and it ends up being down to the courts to decide these things. And that's the least democratic branch. And so it seems to me we have the worst possible outcome because, again, Congress doesn't want to do its job. The really bad thing about this is if we even want to, I think it sounds like you and I think a lot of people agree that Congress should do its job. Now, if we're going to force Congress to do its job, this is problematic in the short term because the environment has changed. For instance, back in the day, there used to be a filibuster that applied to nominations to heads of agencies. And so even if the president wanted to kind of run these things the way he wanted to, you still had to get 60 votes. That's not the case anymore. Not only that, but in order for Congress to actually do its job, Congress would have to rebuild itself. It's much more than a case of will. Since the 1990s, Congress has basically half lobotomized itself by making major cuts in staff, institutional capacity, resource cuts, and because it was a popular thing, we're slashing government, we're starting with ourselves. But what they've done is they've largely neutered their ability to actually do their job. And so for them to reverse course, they would have to approve significant amounts of funding to make Congress institutionally bigger. And I just don't see there being any appetite to do that on the right, especially.
Do you have an issue with, you could probably, where that funding could come from? The agencies. Do you have a problem with having experts suggest technical standards that the members of Congress have to vote on? They vote on technical packages. Because the idea about like COVID, the standard related to a vaccination, a technical expert related to vaccination, you had OSHA was telling everybody they had to wear a mask. So the overreach comes from how much power do they really have and what are they really doing? And in reality, what ends up happening is they make policy that with the force and effect of law. Do you think that do we need to have agencies that make policy with the force and effect of law, or would it be sufficient for you if they're commissioned for advisory work that a representative who gets voted up or down by the people ultimately has to sign off on and use their judgment of whether they agree or not?
There's no way that any government in today's day and age can run if administrative agencies can't make regulations that have the force and power of law, because Congress is simply doesn't have the time or the expertise anywhere close to vote on and to deliberate on every single thing. So it's a balance. And I certainly believe that the balance has gone over far too much in the direction of giving agencies more discretion than they should have.
But you support your viewpoint in working toward a better world. You support that discretion to be narrow and very carefully circumscribed?
Yes, exactly. But then again, that involves Congress actually stepping up and taking responsibility and doing the work and building up its institutional capacity. And unfortunately, that as a political reality, I can dream. I can say, yes, this would be my ideal world in which Congress actually pretended it was in Article 1, or even at least a co-equal branch. But that's not how things are. And because of various incentives, that's just not how things are going to be. And so my concern, and obviously the court's concern, is how do we manage this then if Congress refuses to do its job? And there's no good answer to this. And clearly the kludgy sort of way we've been doing it is not working very well. And it's just a god-awful mess.
Well, that would be a great argument, I think, for the Justice Gorsuch impulse of doing big things. Because like a parent, when you do things for your kids, you enable them to make bad decisions. So one of the reasons Congress doesn't have to do its job is because the courts have enabled them by allowing them to shirk their responsibilities and send decision-making that shouldn't be sent to administrative agencies, query whether if that changes, then the incentive dynamic changes. And I think it's worth, I think that direction for the health of the country and the strength of our future is a good thing because it requires the people's actual participation rather than just everything being a bad reality TV show.
Yeah. And I think if things go in the direction that they're going and the president can fire at will, at least in most agencies, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, are we ready? Is the court ready for mass purges of independent agencies whenever the out party wins the presidency? And the reason I bring this up as a concern to both sides is what we know is that consistency is incredibly important. In any regulatory state, in every modern state has to be a regulatory state. And so if you're a business and you say, well, okay, the FTC rules are this, but we know if this person wins, they're all going to change. Well, if you're a business, how do you plan for that? Or even if you're just investing and all of a sudden, these things are going to be counted differently. This is really tricky. And there's no clear way. And so that's a real downside of these. I mean, and that in fact is kind of one of the main impetuses, I don't know, for the changes we saw early in the late 19th, and early 20th century with civil service reform, because you realize that if you just wipe the board clean, then you have real problems when you're dealing with complex technical issues. And that continuity, that consistency is so important. And that's one of the very real downsides for just cleaning the decks every 4 or 8 years.
Well, I think it is important to keep in mind that the level of employee within the agency or the level of the official are different in terms of constitutional analysis. So it is undeniable that the president has the exclusive power to remove executive officers. And there's other Supreme Court precedent that's very clear on that point. And the argument becomes, well, what are these people? Are they really an executive officer? Today, the FTC is acting like executive officers. So if it acts, walks, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. I think that's a very simple reason that he's going to be able to fire Commissioner Slaughter. But when you talk about the line employees and below, it's more complicated than that. But part of the current malady that the president is standing up to is the idea that the people at the top who set the policy direction for the way they want to turn that ship, it needs to be responsive to the will of the president that the American people elected. And one of the problems right now is that for President Trump, just like President Roosevelt, the people who are making those policy decisions at the head of the agency at the top, whether it's a commission, 5 people, or 1 person, they don't have to be responsive to the president. Yeah. And that is a simpler problem that I think is worthwhile to change because, for example, a past president, I think most people would agree that the people elect a new president, the past president shouldn't be able to bind the future president on the decisions that president makes, including because the American people chose a different path. Hoover and FDR are a perfect example of that, just like Biden and Trump are a good example of that.
And this is exactly the problem. When people talk about the government and big government and government is awful, they're talking about almost exclusively the executive branch because that's the part of government that actually does the things that so many of us don't like or maybe like a lot, depending. And so it's the same thing with government by executive order. You don't get that stability. I mean, every single thing that were practically, so many of the things that Joe Biden did were just wiped away immediately when Donald Trump took office. If the next president is a Democrat, so many of the things that Donald Trump will do to fundamentally alter the path of American government will just be wiped out by whatever Democrat comes in office, if a Democrat wins. And that's the problem with an overly powerful executive. And so it could, because if Congress did its job and constrained the executive, because they have the power to do that by putting these guardrails on these agencies, instead of acting like some sort of parliamentary system, some half-assed parliamentary system, well, that's what's going on here. I mean, so many of the dysfunctions in our government go right back to the fact that Congress is just a steaming pile of crap right now. Yeah. It has been for a while.
I think my personal view, and maybe it'll land with some folks out there if it's helpful, is that, and I view this about federal government too, in terms of the federal government versus the states. They got very strong federalism impulses, and I think our federal government speaks to too many things that the Constitution did not was not set up for it to be in every sphere of American life. And it goes to even the supremacy clause. The way to think about our constitutional structure is that federal power in the supremacy clause, federal power cannot speak to everything, but where it speaks authoritatively. So if they make a decision the federal government makes a policy decision within its orbit, it absolutely should control. We don't have a fiefdom of too many decision makers. Nothing ever gets done. It's a similar dynamic in my view of separation of powers in the executive. I think a non-all-powerful executive is a good thing. An executive within their proper swim lane of executing the laws is a very important thing. But within that swim lane, the president gets to be the president.
Yeah.
And that's a rhetorical refrain that I'll often go to, but it also reflects my view of the way the structure should work, because within his lane, he should get to decide and hire and fire, and he's accountable to the American people for that. And I think that is really, it's a legal point because it's the Constitution, but that's also a policy point because doing things under the rule of law is good policy for stability in the long run, and because the people can change it.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree with you. And the problem is that Congress has made those lanes way too wide. Narrow those lanes down, and absolutely, I think that makes perfect sense. And I guess one way to look at it is if we have a system in which half of the country is totally freaked out when Donald Trump is president, let's say AOC runs and wins in 2028, another half of the country is entirely freaked out and policy just whipsaws back and forth. If that is what we get from our system, then there's something broken, not about AOC or Donald Trump necessarily, but about the nature of a system that allows for that sort of constant change back and forth. And when we are competing with an authoritarian-ish government like China for dominance in the 21st century, and we're going back, ping-ponging back and forth, and they can actually, because of the structure of their system, be much more focused, that should scare the hell out of a lot of people, I think.
Mike, that's a heck of a good point, bud. Seriously, it's a great point. The solution to that is we the people. We have to, and it's a reason that fake division is a problem. We can disagree on an awful lot of things, but we need each other. And we, the people, can insist on a better world where our government is accountable to us and the people that we're electing are doing their job. And that allows us to have that stability without being weak. You can have a very aggressive disagreement about your view, and I'm not a snowflake. I'm happy to listen to it. I'm happy to tell you why I think it's wrong. And you know what? That's why we have elections, and then people get in the seats, and then we have the votes in politics. The art of the possible works out, and then we all stay unified and move forward together. And we can build that world, but it's going to ultimately have to come from us, we the people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, we will close for today, but of course we have a lot more things we want to get to in the midweek episode. But for now, if there was anything we discussed on this episode you disagreed with, you particularly liked, you have a question about whatever, we would love to hear from you. You can get in touch with us in a bunch of ways. Mail at politicsguys.com, also Facebook or X. We always put links in the show notes. And of course, there's our Discord forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time. And if you are a supporter, you get access to that as well as ad-free versions of everything we release and the full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview. And if you want to support us, you can do that on Patreon. They even have a free trial on that. We also have PayPal, Venmo, just send us, Cougar Rants through the mail, whatever you want to do. We are happy for your support. It really does make a big difference. And if you would like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you just can't, you're not in the position to support us financially at this point, just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com. I will be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you're using, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, before we go, a very special thanks to our executive producing team. They are great. Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,